Hello. I am Deborah Morehill, and I am an epileptologist, and I'm a residency program director at the Medical College of Georgia at Augusta University. I have a podcast that our residents are able to see internally, and based on feedback, I know that this is very helpful for them. I've thought about sharing this so that other trainees might also potentially benefit from it. But I know that exposure does matter, and hopefully, we can inspire some young medical students to go into neurology and maybe even inspire some neurology residents to consider strongly going into epilepsy. So, with that, I'll start working on sharing my screen. Throughout this podcast, what we'll do is we will work on EEG pattern recognition. One of the things that I find very helpful as a trainee is to start looking at one particular epoch and go to the next one and the next. When you start taking standardized exams, you'll notice that they will just show you one page of an EEG, and you're supposed to take away a potential hypothesis of what that EEG might represent for that patient. And so this is how we're going to structure our EEG scavenger hunt. These will be posted periodically. It will be a series. You will get one page of an EEG, and I will tell you how many findings there are on each page. This first video serves as an introduction to kind of the series. We want to start the conversation about EEG. I know that EEG is very intimidating, and as a new reader, one must just jump in. Okay, so you're going to hear some terminology throughout the pattern recognition series that you are not familiar with, but you have to start saying the words. If you say them enough and see enough EEGs, then this starts to become second nature to you, as it is to many of us who've been doing this for many years. Again, this series is going to be called EEG Scavenger Hunt Series, but this first video is just an introduction to start the conversation for new readers. I find that the first day on an EEG rotation for our residents is quite daunting, and I think some asynchronous content will help there as well, so you can start to review and start to feel comfortable in your own time and in your own space as well, and we'll help you also along. So just to introduce me, a little bit about me. I'm an educator at heart. My family calls me Brainy, and so my social media is BRAINYMD. I'm a brain neurologist, and as a neurologist, I've always been very interested in academics, and I love a standardized test. I will say that I love standardized testing. It is quite gratifying after you have studied and left it all on the test, so to speak. And as a neurology resident, I was ranked 94th percentile on our standardized right examination. And so pretty high score across the United States amongst peers at the time. And that was against all trainees at the time. I'm a clinical educator. I'm an associate professor at the Medical College of Georgia. I'm also the vice chair of education there. I'm the neurology residency program director, and I'm the chief of our division of epilepsy. We have a level 4 NAC comprehensive epilepsy center. Our residents actually receive 3 EEG lectures monthly for pattern recognition. And again, there is a huge need to break down some of the barriers that exist for our trainees with regards to EEG education. And so, hopefully this EEG scavenger hunt will start to spark some interest. This is intended for MCG neurology and neurosurgery residents, fellows, and ICU staff. These series will be shared to this channel. I do not claim to educate anyone other than the people that have been mentioned. All EEGs have been de-identified and are used with signed consent. for use inside and outside of MCG for education. And again, this does not replace the potential utility gained from formal education in epilepsy. Me, myself, am board certified in clinical neurophysiology and also epilepsy. So the first thing that happens with EEG is electrode placement. And if you look here, a few pictures here, schematics, the technicians, and this is a group of our friendly technicians over at MCG, they will start to measure your patient's head. They start from a nasion, they measure to the enion, and then they also measure from the ear to ear. And the electrodes are placed a distance of 10 to 20% away from each other. And so there are great videos already posted on YouTube of this sort of thing. And so we won't go into more detail of that. But essentially what you get is you get two standard montage arrays, right? And a montage, the nomenclature montage just means putting it all together. So this is a 10-10, which is not the focus of the content today, but these electrodes are 10% apart from each other. And this is a 10-20, which is a combination of 10% off the midline and then 20% to each electrode. The FT9 and FT10 are an addition to this montage so that you can see a little bit more of the anterior temporal pathology there. So the electrodes are named based on location over the various lobes. You'll see this is the frontal lobe. So there's lots of F's here. This is frontal polar, which is more anterior. This is your anterior temporal lobe. These are temporal electrodes here. A1 and A2 are actually electrodes that are placed on the ears. Okay, and then central is C, parietal is P, and occipital is O. Z, the annotation Z here, you can see these are right down the middle. So Z stands for midline electrode, and this is also known as the 0 point, right? As you place electrodes, you'll notice that the numbers increase as they would if you were on a number line. So when you start at 0 here, the Z point, and you go farther left or you go further right, you see that the numbers are increasing. And the nomenclature, actually, the standard nomenclature is that the right side electrodes are even numbers, while the left side electrodes numbers are odd. Okay. So this is a 10-20 montage with FT10 and FT9 added, and this is a 10-10. Okay, so with the montages, you will get a derivation. And what a derivation means is you're going to compare one electrode to the next in the channel. Okay, so for example, FP1 compared to F3, that is going to be a channel consisting of a derivation of those two comparisons. And EEG is not an absolute measurement of things, it's a relative measurement of how FP1 sees those brain waves compared to how F3 sees those brain waves. And so each channel or derivation is going to be a comparison between those waveforms that are seen by each electrode. The convention from the American Clinical Neurophysiology Society is that you will have left over right. In our lab, we start with parasagittal chains up top. The parasagittal chains, so this is right off, this is the midline, and parasagittal is right off the midline. So in our lab, you're going to see left parasagittal, which is these electrodes here, over right parasagittal. And when you're reading EEG, what you want to do is you want to compare homologous brain regions. So the left side should look similarly to the right side, and symmetry matters in EEG. So that's that. So FP1 compared to F3, it's the first one. F3 compared to C3, C3 compared to P3, P3 compared to O1. That's this left parasagittal chain. And here on the right, you have FP2 compared to F4, F4 compared to C4, C4 compared to P4, and P4 compared to O2. Then you'll have your temporal chains. So your temporal chain, again, left over right, you're going to start off with your FP1 compared to F7, F7 compared to, in our lab, FT10, FT10 compared to T7, T7 compared to P7, and P7 compared to O1 on the left. On the right, you're going to have the right temporal chain, FP2 compared to F8, F8 compared to FT10, FT10 compared to T8, T8 compared to P8, and P8 compared to O2 here over that's your right temporal chain. And then you have these midline electrodes, which are compared to each other. So FZ is compared to CZ, CZ is compared to PZ. And then at the bottom of your EEG, you're going to have an EKG channel, which is going to be EKG input 1 and 2. This is a 10-10 montage, and these electrodes are 10% of those measurements apart from each other. And as you can see, this is just going to give you a lot more detail of various areas. You're going to be able to see differences over smaller regions, and this might be helpful if you think someone has like a midline focus or a frontal focus or some focus that you just want a little bit more information about. Maybe you're doing some surgical planning, and they do make caps that have 256 electrodes. So there's always room for more on the scalp to get a little bit more information. Okay, the next principle of EEG is frequency. So if you look here, frequency is typically measured in cycles per second. Okay, so with this comes the frequency of looking at this waveform, and it's marked in blue. It starts here, it cycles, it ends, and you can see now here in purple, this looks like the beginning of the first cycle. So here we go with cycle 2. It cycles through, it ends. And then here you have a new cycle that's starting, but it didn't complete before the second was up. And this duration here is arbitrarily marked as 1 second for demonstration purposes. So you went through 1, 2, and then a half of a cycle. So in 1 second, going through 2.5 cycles per second equals hertz. Frequency equals 2.5 hertz. Okay. When you're thinking about frequency on the scalp EEG, there are several bands that you're going to see. There are 4 major bands of frequency. And so the first is delta, which is 0 to less than 4 hertz or cycles per second. Then theta is above 4 to less than 8. Then you have alpha, which is 8 to 13. Then you have beta, which is greater than 13. Now, if you measure EEG intracranially, you can get much faster waveforms. If you're measuring from the scalp, you are measuring through the scalp, through the skull, through the meninges, and then those electrodes are picking up the brain. That's a lot of insulation that's happening between your electrode and your brain waves. And so if you're measuring intracranially and you've taken off some of that insulation, then you can see faster frequencies there. So these are some of the faster frequencies, also the slower frequencies. This is not the purpose of today's kind of introduction, but you can just see that that's a lot more to learn. Okay, so if you look at this EEG sample that's here, you see your EKG leads left and right at the bottom here. These are your midline electrodes, frontal midline, central midline, and parietal midline. Convention from the American Clinical Neurophysiology Society is that you're going to have left over right. In our lab, we do left parasagittal over right parasagittal. So you'll see when these electrodes, each line is called a channel. When you put these all together, these are known as a montage. This whole thing is known as a montage. We refer to this as AP bipolar. We'll go over that in more detail in subsequent series. But you can see this is left parasagittal. I pointed that out earlier. Right parasagittal here. This is left temporal chain here. When these are together like this, we call this a chain, and this is the right temporal chain. So if you look at your background, you're able to try to count things. And these little deflections in the front, these are eye blinks. So when when your patient is eyes open, you're not going to see a very good background. All right. So this EG is very reactive because you have your posterior dominant rhythm with eye opening. It is kind of going away. So it's attenuating with eye opening or blocking. So that's very good for reactivity in a normal standard awake patient. But if you go back here, you can count these and see how fast your background rhythm is. And so you would count the cycles. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we tried to get a little bit more there, but not quite. So roughly 8.5. So that's pretty normal. Okay. So if you think about the different types of montages, these become very important for various reasons. Because as epileptologists, we want to know, where is the seizure coming from? Where are those epileptiform discharges maximal? Where is our area of interest? What should we be excited about? And so if you look at a bipolar montage where you have bipolar, two poles compared to each other, the point of maximum negativity is going to be marked by phase reversal, typically, right? So there's some exceptions to that. Like, so for example, if you're at the end of a chain, you may not have a phase reversal, but in general, you're going to think about phase reversals with bipolar montage. And I have an example of that coming up. In this referential montage over here, you're going to see that these electrodes are referenced to an electrode. So there's various different types of bipolar montages. There's various types of referential montages. The example of this type of montage here, this referential montage, all of the electrodes are referenced to CZ. So an experienced reader would know that reference into CZ is good if your patient is not asleep. But if your patient's asleep, then reference into CZ is probably a bad idea. But this is just for illustrative purposes. You can reference to any electrode that you choose. One of my favorites is reference average, where you're referencing one electrode or input one references to an average of all of the electrodes. So when you're looking for maximum negativity on a referential montage, you're going to look for maximal amplitude. Okay, so we'll look at this bipolar montage here. So this is a limited montage. So your frontopolar electrodes are not on here. So there's various reasons why they could have been taken off, but they're not on in this case. And so what's happening is you have your left parasagittal over right parasagittal. Oh, excuse me. And this one, you have your left temporal over your right temporal. And then you have your left parasagittal over your right parasagittal here. You have your midline vertex electrodes down here in your EKG. And when you're looking at this one, a phase reversal happens over here. So this is a great example of a phase reversal right here. So in here, you will see that there are two electrodes that are pointing towards each other. This one is kind of having a upward deflection. Meanwhile, this one is having a downward deflection. So when that happens, that tells you that there's some negativity that's happening in here. And if you follow it back, the negativity is happening where these two channels have electrodes in common. So F4 compared to C4 here, C4 compared to P4 there. So C4 is in common with these two channels. And so C4 of this is maximum negativity. Now look down here, because there's even a bigger phase reversal down at the bottom at CZ. And so CZ is a part of this field as well. And just looking at this, if you were reading this EEG, you would flip to several montages to convince yourself which one is most negative. However, with just looking at this, it would appear that CZ is most negative and C4 is also a part of the field. It looks like C3 kind of sees it, but from a distance. And so I would say that this activity is centered around the central midline, and then it's a little projected off to the right more so than the left. Okay, so these were phase reversals. It's a bipolar montage. So this is the activity that gets you excited. This is where the activity is most negative. So if you look at this referential montage, if this is specifically a reference average montage, if you look, you've got your left parasagittal leads compared to an average of all of the electrodes. So reference average, where you compare one electrode input 1 to an average of all of the electrodes. And then you have your right parasagittal chain here, in which you have your right parasagittal, like for example, FP2 compared to an average of all of the electrodes over your temporal chain over your, from the left over your temporal chain from the right. And then you have your midline vertex, your midline electrodes compared to an average as well. And the bottom is your EKG. So if you look at this, your maximum negativity is going to be marked by the area that has the highest amplitude, right? So I see that there is a deflection here, which is kind of sparking my interest. And it also has a field here. So it looks like this one is, you would measure it. You have calipers on your screen. You would measure this. I did measure this earlier. FP2 is maximum, followed by F8. So this is frontopolar, and it kind of goes off more laterally into the right frontal region here. Okay. FP2 sees it also. It's included in the field, but it's at a distance. Okay. And so we'll talk about this as these series go on. So the second one here, you can see this is a deflection as well. So this one, after measuring this earlier, F8 is going to be maximum here, followed by FT10. You also do have a field that includes your frontal and your frontopolar electrodes, but they're at a distance from it. The maximum negativity is here. So there's two epileptiform discharges on this screen. One is maximum from FP2, the other is maximum from F8, because this is the point of the highest amplitude. And when you're measuring amplitude on your screen, you're going to start from the lowest deflection here, and you're going to measure to the highest deflection there, and you're going to take that as your amplitude. Like I mentioned in EEG, symmetry really matters. Okay, so symmetry, if you look at left parasagittal compared to right parasagittal, if you were to measure these all out, they're pretty comparable. It's mostly symmetric. When you're recording brain waves or EEG, you have your electrodes here, input 1, input 2. You are recording through several layers: skin, bone, dura, and then finally you get down to the brain. And so you're recording through all of these layers. So if your electrodes are able to have the same level of insulation on one side as compared to the other side, it's likely that your amplitude is going to be comparable and symmetric if there's no pathology going on. EEG has a lot of hypotheses that have to be drawn. So if you're reading EEG and you look at this one, you can kind of see just from a distance here that left and right parasagittal, a little bit different. So your left parasagittal looks like it has a lower amplitude than your right parasagittal. And then here, left temporal certainly has a lower amplitude than your right temporal. So it looks like something's going on over the left, most marked over the left temporal chain. So when you read an EEG, oftentimes you have to figure out which side is the abnormal side, which side is normal. Sometimes in the ICU, it's hard to tell which side is abnormal, which side is normal, because both sides may have some abnormalities going on. Sometimes there is no completely normal side, specifically in very ill patients. So if you look over here, this illustration is trying to show you that, and these are not going to line up with this image, but if you have a stroke on one side, you could potentially have a lower amplitude. You could potentially have focal slowing, where your frequency is slower than it is on the normal side. Okay, so that's one option. Maybe you have a stroke that's happening over one side versus the other. The other option is, or some sort of a brain lesion where there's a problem going on, and on the other side or other electrodes, things are normal. Then here, if you look, maybe you have a skull defect. So this red area would be someplace where our friendly neurosurgeons have kind of been X marks the spot where they've been. And so they've cut the skull on this particular example. And if you're recording with this electrode through here, you'll notice if the skull is cut, that is going to decrease the amount of insulator capacity that you see on this side. So you may see a higher amplitude over here if there's a skull defect, right? Because these electrodes, compared to electrodes that are adjacent, that are overlying intact skull, these electrodes are going to have easier ability to pick up on brain waves that are coming through here, because the skull is not continuous. Okay, so this would be called a breach defect or a skull defect. Another option is maybe you have a space occupying lesion, as you can see here. Maybe there's some pus, maybe there's a space occupying lesion, maybe your patient has meningitis, perhaps your patient might have a subdural hematoma or something going on in which there's more insulation happening that your electrodes have to record through. So now, instead of just skin, bone, dura, you also have a hematoma or pus or something that you're also recording through before you get to brain. So this side could have a decreased amplitude. And so when you're reading EEG, the symmetry really matters. You're going to hone into symmetry. It's going to make all the little hairs go up on your neck, like, what's going on? Let me figure this out. And any good EEG reader is going to try to figure this out before you go to imaging. They're not paying us to be neuroradiologists. They are wanting our expertise on the EEG and what's going on based on the brain waves. And so you'll make lots of hypotheses about what might be going on for your patient. So again, this was just an introduction, a brief introduction. What this is not is a replacement for Niedermeyer or some of the very well-known EEG textbooks. What this is not is trying to accomplish, learning EEG all in one session. This is trying to accomplish starting the conversation that will allow you to kind of get an introduction to EEG as a new reader. Based on feedback from my residents, they do mention that it is more beneficial to sit and read with someone as opposed to reading a textbook, because someone can walk you through and talk you through the cases. And so hopefully this is the value of this series, is being able to talk with someone and also see this on your own time and rewind and go back through it several times and learn EEG and on your own time, and be able to learn something new each time. And I always tell our learners, it's not about what you don't know. It's about coming to sit with us in clinic, or reading those EEGs with us. And each time you walk away, hopefully you learn something new. So hopefully, if you're a new EEG reader, hopefully this sparked your interest. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully this might make you go pick up one of those big, thick textbooks and read a little bit more. But there's still so much to cover. So throughout the series, we'll talk about considerations for the technical quality of the study. We'll talk about artifacts and normal variants. We'll talk about abnormal patterns, including seizure onsets and interictal discharges and ictal-interictal continuum findings. We'll talk about field localization. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we'll go through one case at a time, which is going to consist of one screen or one page, one epoch of an EEG. And we're going to approach it as if it's a scavenger hunt, and the solution will be posted 1 week after the initial EEG has been posted. So hopefully this was fun for you. And like, subscribe, and share. This is our group here at the Medical College of Georgia. If you hit that notification button, hopefully you can come back and learn with us. And this is our group of doctors and a few nurses in there, and our lead technician, Kieran, at the back. But we like EEG, we like teaching, and hopefully we might have a few guests on here who might have also some insight and some cases that they want to share as well. But it's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much. Bye.